the Soviets and the United States and the spying that's going on between them. But when we look at this and we look at our ability then to combat communism, the other way that we're going to combat communism, besides kind of this ideological war that's going on between us, through the use of Truman and his radio programs that were called, something.
Wait, I'm thinking. The True Man.
Nope. Truman's radio programs that were broadcast.
I wrote it.
The Voice of America?
Yes, the Voice of
Yeah.
America.
Whoa,
Good job.
okay.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
right. The opposite direction. But yes, the Voice of America. So that becomes our way to combat communism on, like, kind of more this ideological front. But you have to understand something. If you are a country that is desperately trying to rebuild from war, right, you have no economic basis. So it's going to be really hard for you when your countryside has basically been blown apart over the course of World War II to rebuild and for people to have jobs. And when people don't have jobs, they can't work, buy things, feed their children, provide themselves with housing and their families with housing, right? They can't provide themselves with health care. All of these things that when Roosevelt does his speech, the Four Freedoms speech, right, he argues that everyone should have freedom from want, right? Freedom from the basic or to have these basic necessities, food, shelter, clothing. But in post-war World War II Europe, many people, citizens of those countries, don't have that. And so they begin looking for some sort of an outlet that's going to provide them with that economic prowess or that economic boost. And communism is appealing in that because you're basically telling those people, we will provide you with the job. If you work, you will make money. And you're not going to make money and be like a wage laborer that's constantly working super, super hard but never getting ahead in life. If you work hard, it will be equitably distributed. And we will provide you with housing. And we will provide you with food. And we will provide you with medical care. We will give you the things that you are so desperate for. So in a war-stricken or post-war state of Europe, communism, on the surface at least, is very appealing to people. So we have to combat that, not only with words to show, hey, look, democracy is actually a really, really good thing because you get a voice in your government, and communism doesn't allow you to have that voice. And the harder you work in a capitalist state, the more you will get, in theory at least, right? But communism works the same way. In theory, everything is equitable amongst everybody. But in practice, neither one of them actually work the way they're supposed to in theory. But we have to combat that economic problem as well, because if we don't deal with the economic issue, then ultimately we haven't dealt with some of the factors that are drawing people towards communism. So this gets laid out, I'm sorry, I don't know how, I must have pushed through these. So, but this gets laid out in Marshall, Secretary of State George Marshall's plan. And basically what he says is much like the Truman Plan, where we gave economic aid to Greece and Turkey, we now need to give economic aid to all of the European countries that are threatened by communism, and all that request any kind of economic aid. That would make communism less appealing and would make democracy and capitalism more appealing. And so over the course of this, it will offer $13 billion in economic aid to the European states. Now initially under this plan, the idea was that lots of individuals would be able to then regain and have some ability to rebuild their economic system. Now at first, right, this is $13 billion. And Marshall's going to Congress saying, hey, Congress, $13 billion to rebuild Europe. That's a lot of stinking money, right? I mean, that's a lot of money, $13 billion, okay? And so, at supportive of that. But largely because of the continued expansion of the Soviet Empire, as well as in 1948, Czechoslovakia basically has an overthrow of their government that's sponsored by the Soviets, and as a result of that, Czechoslovakia falls to communism
Oh.
and becomes a part of the USSR.
Do you know which one is the Velvet Revolution?
That's the Czech Republic.
Yes, it is.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's
okay,
what
yeah.
I'm talking about
That
here.
was the one where it was released in the Guerrilla
Yeah.
Republic, I feel like that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
just like.
That's when they're getting rid of communism.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
So that's later. My European history is
Okay.
not so great, so I apologize,
Okay.
but it's
Okay.
not something that I've done a whole lot of study in for quite some time, so I'm not real great with it, but,
It's
okay?
okay.
But what we see happen through that, though, is it's kind of proof to Congress that that Soviet expansion and Soviet aggression exists, and that the long telegram of Kennan is kind of coming to fruition, right? The idea that the Soviets would go unmatched and through this expansion. So we begin sending that monetary aid to Europe, and the reality of it is over the course of it, rather than appeasing the Soviets and allowing them to do what they want, we send a very large portion of money, mostly to Western Europe, but it really reduces the appeal of communism in some of the states where it was most appealing, including in Italy, Belgium, and also in Austria. Okay? And those were 3 states that we were most fearful of losing those to communism. Now, the vast majority, though, of the money, as you can see from this chart, went to
Britain.
Britain, to the United Kingdom, and then, secondarily, to France. Okay? So the majority of the money goes really to our people that we were already in an alliance with, and quite frankly, we did not have to have any type of a fear that France, or Great Britain for that matter, would have fallen to communism. However, by helping them to rebuild their post-war economies, it does help to rebuild post-war economies throughout Europe. And as a direct result of that, we see that there is a 33.5% increase in the gross national products of the countries that were involved in this. And as a result of that, those economies become actually better in the post-war years than they were leading up to World War II. Those in support of the Marshall Plan then will call this an economic miracle of Europe, that we were able to rebuild Europe in such a short amount of time. Yay, go democracy. But it works. Remember, its primary cause was to prevent what? The spread of communism. Did it prevent the spread of communism?
Yes. Well,
Yeah.
In the regions that received the money, did it prevent the spread of communism?
Yeah.
Yes, it did. Communism does not take hold in some of those regions whose governments are still very shaky, right? Austria, government, really shaky, right? They were overtaken by Hitler during Nazi occupation. Italy was run by a fascist government by Mussolini, right? And so their government is very weak as well coming out of the war. And so as a result of that, we do see that those are able to succeed in not falling to communism. Now, the reality of it is this. Most Eastern European states do not actually take any of the economic aid. Not that it wasn't offered to them, because it was, but they were largely prevented from accepting that aid by the Soviets. Under suggestion, threat, etc., okay, the Soviets largely prevent them from accepting that aid from the United States. The other part of it is the Soviets like, all right, Marshall Plan, okay, U.S., you've got your plan, we'll come up with our own plan to basically block the economic aid that you're providing. We are telling them, hey, communism can do that too. We can give money to you as well, and it'll work just as well. And the Soviets do that through what's called the Molotov Plan. Okay? Same basic concept. send money into an area, make that type of government seem more appealing, and prevent also the spread then of democracy into those Eastern European states.
Why do they care so much, like, if a nation is capitalist or communist? Like, why do we care? Why does the Soviet Union care so much?
Okay, good question. Let's look at Soviet Union first, right? Coming out of World War II, you have to look at the Soviets' past history, okay? The Soviets are very fearful of another large-scale German invasion of the Soviet Union, right? It's happened twice in very recent memory, okay? So they want to build up a much larger force, military force, etc., as well as creating a buffer zone in those Eastern European states to prevent that from ever happening again. They also have a very strong distrust of the United States because we refused to open up a Western front earlier. They wanted us to open up D-Day and get going into northern France much earlier than we did. We delayed, in part, because we didn't want as many of our men dying, but that largely led to the Russians being slaughtered in certain areas, such as Stalingrad. And the Russians very much hold that they look at that very negatively. Does that make sense? And they hold that. The best way that I can explain how that feeling of distrust existed and that feeling of hardship that occurred after the war is when I was doing my student teaching up in Grand Forks, my advising teacher at UND in education sent me an email saying, hey, we have this program where there's some Russian teachers that are going to come and they're going to observe American teaching system and how we educate and train American teachers. So they're going to be coming in and observing you while you're student teaching. Okay, sure, why not? The unfortunate part for them maybe was the fact that they showed up on the day that I was talking specifically about the Battle of Stalingrad, and I had this giant political cartoon on my screen of a big gigantic German tank and a little itty bitty Russian trying to like push back the German tank. Totally appropriate for what I was teaching, right?
Yeah.
And I didn't know the backstory of any of these people. But I'm teaching as an American teacher, right? So it's a good example of what American education system is in our training system, right? Unfortunately, though, where this takes a wrong turn is one of my observers, her grandfather happened to die at the Battle of Stalingrad, and she very much took offense to my political cartoon that I had up on my screen. And it was very upsetting to her. I didn't find out this from her, but later from my cooperating teacher, or from my supervising teacher at UND, who then was like, rah, 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 rah. I don't know. How am I supposed to know? Yeah, exactly, right? But and that was in 2006. So if those memories and those feelings can still be that strong in 2006, imagine what they are in 1945, 46, 47, 48, 50. Does that make sense? Through the Cold War. And so you have to kind of look at it in context. And that's kind of the best way that I can explain their anti-democracy, anti-capitalism. Does that make sense?
But why are they trying to, like, spread communism? Like, why don't they...
Because it allowed them to create that buffer zone. Does that make sense? And allows them to spread their ideal, which they think is better than a capitalist system. Yes?
So the reason why they don't like capitalism is because the U.S. is capitalist and they don't like
Yes,
the U.S.
yes.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
But they were friends.
Okay?
So they don't
Well, they
necessarily-
weren't really friends. We've never really been friends. We were more, again, remember the quote, or the saying, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. That is very much our relationship with the Soviet Union during the course of World War II. They are our ally because we are both fighting against the same dude. Okay? Or the same force, the same enemy force. Now, from capitalism took communism from that other side of things then, communism, this idea of everyone owns or the government owns everything, is starkly in contrast to a democracy and a democratic system, because of our democratic system, our capitalist system, has always been very much laissez-faire, government being hands-off. And when you think about that, that goes all the way back to the foundations of who we were, not wanting a big, large, central government that would control the aspects of our lives as individual citizens, right? It's part of the reason why we broke away from Great Britain in the first place, was because we wanted more control and more say over what happened in our system. Does that make sense? Communism does not allow for that say by the people.
Like the freedom of speech.
Yes. Freedom of speech, freedom of free will, basically. Does that make sense? Okay.
Megan.
That is a very philosophical question that you'll have to save for Johansson's class. Okay? Okay? If you're in it or not. Does that help to answer your question?
Yeah.
And when we look at this from the U.S. perspective, the U.S. is very fearful of the fall of the United States to communism as well. Largely because of the riots within unions and the tensions in the labor force. Does that make sense? Okay. So, as a result, though, of the Marshall Plan, the United States, remember, is sending aid to those Western states. That includes Western Germany. It also includes Berlin, because you have to remember that Berlin, much like Germany as a whole, is divided into spheres of influence, right? But Berlin is located
In.
East Germany, right? So,
Right.
problem, right? The city, the capital, is located on the eastern side, completely, right? It's surrounded in that eastern bloc, which is controlled by the Soviets, who are trying to prevent the spread of democracy and the spread of that capitalist system. But the United States is like, here, have some money, West Berlin. Look at what we can provide you as a capitalist state, as a democracy. Wouldn't you like to be a democracy too? And the West Berliners are like, yay, prosperity. And the East Berliners are like,
Hey, can we get in?
can we have some of that? And the Soviet Union's like, no, you are not allowed to do that. Here's part of the reason why the Soviet Union wants the the East Berliners and Eastern Germany to not get that aid, because they still blame them for the war. They blame them for everything that happened, for the loss of life by the Russian soldiers. And so if we can basically tell you no, and not only no, but you're going to help rebuild the Russian economy first, and then we'll take care of maybe Eastern Germany, because you need to be punished for causing this war and causing this hardship on Russia in the first place. So here we are, money, 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 Western Germany and West Berlin. And East Berliners are like, I'm so hungry. Okay? Literally. Okay? And that extravagance just doesn't really work well with each other. So the Soviet Union, as a result of that Marshall Plan, they make the decision then to blockade all of Berlin, so that support could not come in to West Berlin and basically make the East Berliners in a position where they wanted to revolt and overthrow what they saw as their communist oppressors. Right? But now, the West Berliners are starting to starve. Well, West Berlin is in control by the United States, France, and Great Britain, which largely winds up becoming the United States rather than the collective three, right? And those merge into just being the United States. The Soviets basically say, look, you need to stop doing this, and the U.S. is like, we're not backing down. And as a result of that, they began to airlift supplies into the starving West Berliners. The Berlin Airlift then proceeds with this operation of sending 4,500 tons of food, coal, other materials that they would need by air into the city every day.
I remember this. It was
Okay?
planes.
And yes, the planes just came in, dropped things, left, came back, dropped things, left, and that continued to proceed through the course of the Berlin Airlift.
I remember this so vividly in Johansson's class. He told us that like the planes were so close to each other when they were landing, like they had to land like super quick and then load stuff and then quickly go off and then like just always just planes.
Yeah, just planes constant. And it was just a constant flow. But here's the
Always
deal.
planes.
You have these
I'm
planes
just gonna write
dropping goods into West Berlin. Are some of those goods going to make it into East Berlin? Yep. Okay?
Well, that's good, but I meant like.
Yeah. Darn it for the Soviets, right? Yeah. But in reality of it, some of those goods are going to make it into East Berlin. And who comes out looking like the good guy?
The U.S.
The
Yeah.
U.S., right? We are going to prevent the poor people from starving to death. Look at what the Soviets are doing by allowing these people to starve, by closing off Berlin. How dare they do this to the people? And so the United States continues to go through this flight and these flights, and over the course of 11 months then, we literally were dropping supplies pretty much 24/7. Eventually, Stalin is forced to back down and pull his troops out of West Berlin. But what you need to understand is that as a result of the Berlin Airlift, and as a result of that, it becomes even more a propaganda war, right? This war of who's better. And that's something that you really need to understand about the Cold War, and is very much typified by the Berlin blockade and then subsequently the Berlin Airlift, is that it paints this picture of a democracy, of a capitalist system being better than that of a communist state. Or at least that's the image that we want the world to perceive. And that's why we have images such as this to get people to say, look, okay, it is better to be a democracy, right? Milk is the new weapon of democracy, okay? And whether you like milk or not, the concept remains true, right? All it is food, is sustenance, right? Think about it this way. A child can live on milk, and only milk, for an entire, basically, actually, you could keep feeding your child milk well beyond their first year of life, okay? And it does, okay? Literally, I had my, our pediatrician told us that we should keep feeding my youngest just formula to make sure that he's getting enough calories, because he doesn't need anything else nutritionally other than what is in formula. Because he's little compared to his, like, where he should be. He's like in the 8th percentile. But that being said, right, a human being can survive on that basically indefinitely. So milk is nutrition, right? That's the whole point of this, is that milk would provide you with what you need to survive, okay? All right, so now, what the other part of this that you need to understand, CCOT here, right? Change in continuity. The biggest change between pre-World War II and post-World War II is that the United States and others, when there is act, not cow milk is not as good for you, but
No, I know.
like people milk. That being said, okay, so what you have to understand here is pre-World War II, appeasement. post-World War II, the Berlin blockade, yes, it's containment, but it is the direct opposite of appeasement. We are not going to allow a country to act aggressively against another country or against another region without somebody stepping in to stop it. Does that make sense? Now, as a result of that, we begin in 1949 then to begin creating alliance systems that would help to support those European states. And we see the creation of NATO, okay, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Initially, it's the United States, Canada, and 10 European nations. And it was designed for mutual defense. Largely designed and created by Robert Taft, who's the grandson of our former president, William Howard Taft. Okay? We begin to create this system. I apologize, I said it was created. It was not created by Taft. It was created by Secretary of State. It was largely argued against by Taft because Taft argued that it was an entangling foreign alliance.
Oh, this is true.
Well, you know what? Too late for that.
Truly.
It's a little late, but
Yeah, sorry, Georgie. I forgot all about it.
so NATO is so it's U.S., Canada, and then could we just say like the ones where the countries where democracy was in it?
Yes,
Yeah.
basically. Now, then, not to be outdone, in 1955, the USSR will create the Warsaw Pact, which is again basically the Soviet states and those that had fallen to communism. Again, it becomes that war of ideology, which is better, right? Now there are other security forces that are created as well. ANZUS, which is a collective security between the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. So it's Australia, New Zealand, and the US. ANZUS. Okay. There's also CENTO, which is the Central Treaty Organization. So it's the Central America Treaty Organization. And then there's also SEATO, which is SEATO, which is the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. Okay, they'll wind up being created.
We just love acronyms.
Yes, we do. Go acronyms. Okay. But as a result of this, though, we see the division then between those that would be pro-communist, okay, and those that would be pro-democracy. And you can firmly see then that Iron Curtain becomes largely defined. Now, that is less of the Iron Curtain than if you remember from yesterday, because the original Iron Curtain that Churchill talked about included Austria, included parts of Italy, and included Yugoslavia, okay? So we've been able to hold back some of that Iron Curtain and prevent that spread.
Poor Albania. It's communist over
It-
on the side.
Oh, that sucks.
Now, with all of that going on, 1949 largely becomes kind of the year of shock, as it's kind of called. Because we see the fall of China to communism. Now, the United States had already been giving billions of dollars in aid to support the pro-US leader, Chiang Kai-shek, during the course of World War II. In 1949, though, Mao Zedong And his communist forces basically are able to overthrow Czech's forces and are able to establish that communist state. They are largely supported by the Soviet Union through this. And after the fall of China, within 2 months, they've signed an alliance with Russia, with the Soviet Union. The loss of China, having been an ally of the United States through both World War I and World War II, becomes a great blow to the United States and is looked at as being a major defeat in our containment policy. You have to understand what this truly means. 25% of the world's population was living in China.
Whoa. Well.
So in one shot, 25% of the world's population became communist.
Quarter of the
That's like the
world.
worst thing that can happen.
Here.
Can you imagine you wake up one morning and that happens?
Oops.
Truman is largely criticized for causing the loss of China to communism.
What? I thought he was like trying to prevent this.
Yeah.
But the
But he's the
president gets
president when it happens, just as like the Hoover is the president when the Great Depression hits. Is Hoover really responsible for the Great Depression?
no.
No, but he did not do anything to fix it.
Yeah, he didn't do a whole lot to fix it. I mean, he did things, but it didn't fix it, right? It didn't solve the problem.
Interesting.
Yeah, and presidents are just blamed for everything, like, just like gas prices. Like the gas prices, they're just like, Obama's doing good.
Yeah.
It's like, he had
Yeah,
nothing to do with this.
Or it's Obama's fault when gas prices raise, or
It's just
whatever
like-
else, right?
And he doesn't get
Thanks,
Yeah.
Obama.
The economic depression that occurred in 2008 was George W. Bush's fault, okay? His fault, okay? Doesn't really work that way, but that's the reality of how our system works, okay?
Just don't misunderestimate Bush.
Yeah, I agree with you, I agree with you, but I mean, you have to look at, they get blamed, right, for what goes well, and also what doesn't go so well. Does that make sense?
That's a rhetorical strategy, I forgot what it's called. where you-
Which one?
The one where you blame someone for something that happened and they're not related at all.
You
know what I'm talking about?
Yes, I do.
That's
Possibly.
No.
Yeah, I don't know.
Correlation
Anyway,
is not
so,
mean.
what we have then, though, is that basically, and Truman basically, to that, says, look, China was never mine to lose, right? I didn't lose China. China fell on his own. We tried to support China. We tried to help them, but it was the people of China's choice, in a way, to overthrow that system of government. And he basically says, it's not my fault. I couldn't have prevented it. And the reality of it is he tried to support the pro-democratic state, and it just doesn't work.
So they were democratic before the
Yeah.
Civil War? or whatever?
Yeah.
That seems like forever. Like China was never really democratic.
I mean, it's not really like a pure democratic state, but it's not communist. It's more of like a constitutional, at that point they're a little bit closer to a constitutional monarchy, but not a pure, not like the British system. That makes sense. It would,
So like a constitutional monarchy, kind of like what Japan is.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Does that make sense? Kind of, sort of, a little bit. Okay, so, but the reality of it is that, but Truman's largely to blame, or says is blamed by it, and the United States basically says, look, the People's Republic of China does not exist. We are not going to recognize it. So the USSR begins then to boycott the Security Council and the UN in protest, and the United States and the Soviet Union once again go to bat with each other over whether or not a country could be communist or not.
Wait, okay, the UN doesn't recognize
The United States doesn't recognize, and the UN basically says that Shanghai Shek's Security Council that was created still exists. So they technically aren't recognizing China under Mao Zedong as a communist state either. In fact, the UN actually doesn't make China a part of the permanent nations until 1979. Okay? Truman also, in a reaction to the fall of China, and also in 1949, like I said, it's the year of shock, right? In 1949, the Soviets are able to detonate their first atomic bomb. But wait, right? Well, like I said, as early as 44, the Soviets knew we were working on an atomic project. They just didn't know exactly what that meant or what that would look like. The Soviets, post-war, were pissed that they felt that Great Britain and the United States had prevented them from having the knowledge of the atomic weapon. Now, to be perfectly honest, Great Britain didn't really know much about the atomic weapon either. And even Truman didn't know about the atomic weapon until he became president, even though he was vice president.
Does the vice
That's
president
how-
like not know about other secrets? That the
Sometimes, depending on how high of a level of national security it's considered. Does that make sense?
How did they start, like, thinking about the idea of an atomic bomb?
Albert Einstein.
It's a matter of math.
Yes.
When you split the atom,
Because
it's
Einstein
a huge
figures out how to split an atom.
amount of energy.
And the energy that's created out of that would
It's what the sun does, essentially.
yeah. If we figured out and we're like, hey, if we can figure out how to harness that energy, we can make a really powerful weapon. So we begin exploring that idea through the Manhattan Project and subsequently are able to create 3 nuclear weapons.
But, like, how did they keep it all secret?
Because there were lots of people working on the project with all very high levels of security. Most of them didn't have all the key pieces to it. They only had the information that they needed to know to work on the element of what they were working on. And in addition to that, in some cases, the people were basically sequestered and put in housing development areas, and you stayed there. And you lived basically on the base, but you didn't leave, whether you were a civilian contractor or a military contractor. So your contact with the outside world was pretty limited. Does that make sense?
That's just really scary to think, like, there's probably stuff right now that
I am sure there are weapons like that or that are being developed that have that same kind of security level today. We would be remiss to think that there were not. Okay? Now, as a result of that, though, there are now 2 nuclear superpowers. Now, we're not entirely sure early on how the Soviets get some of this information, but as I stated, we know now, as of 1995, based on release of former Soviet secret classified documents, that there were a lot of Soviet officials spying in the U.S. government. Okay? And so we know that that's probably how they got it, although the Rosenbergs get blamed, and we'll talk about the Rosenbergs tomorrow. But as a result of it, it launches us into a nuclear war. And a not nuclear war, but a nuclear race. We continue to build up and build up and build up our nuclear arms and the amount that we are able to have. And rather than reducing our number of arms, as advisors had called for him to do, Truman instead increases our nuclear program. And so we see that through that then, by 1952, the United States is able to create a hydrogen bomb. And by 1953, the Soviets also have a hydrogen bomb. The H-bomb then basically becomes a deterrent because it is mutually assured destruction. If one was launched, the other would surely fire. But the H-bomb basically becomes an instrument of the ability for the first time in history, for mankind to erase itself
That's probably the best option for the world, to be honest.
and end civilization as we knew it. Over the course then between 1945 and 1990, the US will spend $5.5 trillion in creating our nuclear arsenal. So much so that if we look at the creation of this, and North Dakota, by the way, used to be a huge storage place for our nuclear arsenal, so much so that if North Dakota ever would have decided, hey, we want to be our own country, we would have been the 3rd largest nuclear superpower. Also, so much so that when individuals in school were growing up, they were trained that if there was ever a nuclear explosion, like if you were in Fargo, that you were supposed to face, I think I'm facing the right direction, south, because if there was a nuclear explosion, it would be coming from up in Grand Forks, and Grand Forks or Minot would have been the targets of that explosion. And so as a result, if you faced south, you would survive, and your retinas wouldn't be burned by the flash of light. The reality of it is, based off of the radius size of an H-bomb, you would be dead anyways. So,
At least your retinas have a little longer.
but at least you feel a little bit better that you can go to a fallout shelter and that there's a plan. And if you talk to some of your parents are old enough to remember doing duck and cover drills as students in school. We're literally much like a fire drill or a lockdown or any of the other drills that we do, right? You practiced what would happen if there was a nuclear explosion. If you knew what was coming versus if you didn't know what was coming. And you practiced what would happen. When is our class period over?
35.
35, okay. So I will pick up with showing you duck and cover, which is a U.S. basically instrument of propaganda, but also a way to train Americans on what to do in case there was a detonation of a nuclear weapon.
Would it work?
Tomorrow, no. And actually, really interesting, there's areas in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. There's this one area, I believe it's in Hiroshima, where there's a series of concrete steps. And still to this day, you can see the outline of the body from where, like, it was basically instantaneously burned. Yeah, there's a shadow that was burned into the steps. So. But although yes, it wouldn't work, but here's the deal, right? Why do we do those types of drills? Because it makes you feel safer, it makes you feel like there's a plan. Here's the reality of it. Now, God forbid that there was ever like a shooting in our school or something like that, right? But here's the reality of it. Do we know if anything that we have done to try to prepare for a school shooting would actually effectively save lives?
We don't.
No. But why do we do them?
Just so we have a plan, so nobody like
So
panics.
we have a plan and people don't panic. Before we used fire drills, when there was a fire in schools, kids panicked, especially little kids, and they would run and hide. And kids died in fires in schools frequently. Kids don't die in school fires anymore. Why? Because we practice.
School fires not.
Now we just like,
But part of